missing, or they just have a profound desire to relive this lesson. They have it there. All right. So I've got below here the British royal family.
Why does that child at the bottom not have a prince?
Well, why indeed? So now, okay, we don't have time to get into royal politics. No, stop. No, thank you. Moving on. So here we have the royal family tree as of a couple of years ago. And there it is. And what I want to use this for is to help us kind of get the idea of what is somebody who is your ancestor? What's an ancestor? Okay, I like that. So somebody who came before me in my family tree. All right, so my Uncle Bob, is he my ancestor? Why not? He's before me. Pretty sure. So why not? Why isn't he my ancestor? Or is he? Have I convinced you? Okay. Type of thing is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. If that works, you can just write on your exams and be like, it's a math type of thing. And I'd have to be like, all right, I can't argue with that. That's true. But I like where you're going with this. Yeah.
Is there a certain amount of years you can classify for ancestors?
As in, like, they have to be more than a certain number or less than? More than. Okay, so what about my great uncle Leopold? I'm assuming I have one. There's got to be one back there somewhere. See my ancestor? Yeah? I'm seeing some people shaking their head. Now I'm seeing a cocking of the eyebrow. If I say anything, do you just believe it, guys? If I'm like, yes, that person is my... If I said, like, George Washington is my ancestor, you'd be like, Orlando said it. Write it down. George Washington must be, at some level, a distant cousin of mine, right? Like, at some level. Is he my ancestor? Charlie? Thoughts? Is George Washington my ancestor? Charlie, tell me!
I don't know if
A man of my profound dignity, just like President Washington. What's your theory? Share it with me.
If, because your uncle didn't have any part in making you.
Aha.
Just blood-related by grandparents.
That's right. Bingo. Nailed it. Perfect answer. Back to the Future rules. All right? Time travel rules. Here's ready for the easiest definition of an ancestor. If you built a time machine out of a DeLorean and you got up to, 88 kilometers an hour and 1.21 gigawatts, which he mispronounces gigawatts of energy, you go back in time and you kill that person, what happens to you? You're not alive because they're a direct part of your family tree. And if you can go back in time and kill that person, which, by the way, don't, like, that's rude. But if you can do that and you're still around, then they're not your ancestors. Does that make sense? So it's not just being a relative who came before you, but it's somebody who's directly in the line of births that leads to your births. And that's what we're going to say here. So it is someone who was directly in the line of births leading to someone else's. Yeah. Yes, of course. Now as to where it is, that's a whole other question. Right over there. Mila has one for you. All right. So for example, if we talk about Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. I don't know if that's still her title. I know they've stepped away from the whole thing, and I don't want to know, so don't start telling me. Who is her ancestor on this chart? Nobody. This chart isn't about her. Her chart would be over here, right? Because this chart is all of the descendants of these guys. So these guys are the ancestors of everybody who appears on this chart, except the people who marry in. Right? Does that make sense? So, who aren't they ancestors of? Well, they're not Meghan's ancestors. Who's somebody else they aren't the ancestor of?
Philip.
Yeah, Philip, Diana, Camilla, Catherine, and that's it on here, right? Does that make sense? Who are two people who are Archie's ancestors, and who are two people who aren't Archie's ancestors? Okay, ancestors versus not ancestors.
Diana and Charles.
Diana and Charles are? Are or are not? I think, like, if we go Archie, Megan's an ancestor and Harry's an ancestor, right? And if we travel up, is William an ancestor of Archie? No. But if we go up, who are his parents? Yeah, Diana and Charles. Now, Diana would have her own family tree we could track. It's not here, right? Who are Charles' ancestors? Philip and Elizabeth, right? And then who are Elizabeth's ancestors? Elizabeth and George, right? Good. Does that make sense? And then who's a non-ancestor? Everyone else, right? Does that make sense? So everyone else is related. They would all share some genetics with our buddy Archie here, but they aren't Archie's ancestor. They aren't a part of his direct line. And then keep in mind, there's a whole tree coming back from here too. And how many parents does Megan have, biologically speaking? Two. And each of those would have? And each of those would have two. And of course, how many parents does Diana have, biologically speaking? Two. And of course, each of them would have two. And each of them would have two. And you see how quickly your ancestral tree grows, right? With each generation, you have lots and lots and lots of ancestors in the past. Does that make sense? Yeah. Questions about that? Okay. So an individual's genetics, and we'll talk more about that in a later unit. This is the DNA that serves as a blueprint for them. Comes only from their ancestors. So every single gene in your body is either from an ancestor somewhere in the past, or is from an ancestor somewhere in the past and then has changed, has modified over time through random processes, through just like degradation, through just what can accidentally happen to genes over time. Does anyone know what we call those kind of changes to someone's genetics? Sorry? Yeah, they're one of the driving factors of evolution, but what do we actually call it when somebody's DNA, their genetics changes? Yeah, that's right, mutations. Literally, mutation just means to change. You talk about something being mutable, it is changeable. They talk about like the immutable grace of God in Scripture, right? That's the unchanging grace of God. Immutable, mutable, meaning to change. All right. So that is the concept of ancestry. Why is that so important? Well, it's important because we have, as we estimated, maybe as many as 10 million different species on planet Earth. We've identified over 1 million of them. But they all are the result of evolution over time from common ancestors. If you go back in time far enough, we share an ancestor with maybe every single living thing on Earth. Certainly every living animal on Earth. If you go back far enough, we share a common ancestor with them. We don't know if life sprang up only once or if it sprang up a few different places, but what we know is that in the interregnum, in the time leading up to now, all of the new species that have come into existence haven't just flashed into existence. It's not like one day there was a lightning bolt and all of a sudden there was a horse on top of a mountain. That's not how horses got here. Horses got here because they were other animals who, for a variety of reasons, experienced changes to their genetics. And over time, those changes compiled and made them different enough from their ancestor that now they were considered a new species. And that ancestor that they came from themselves came to being because they, had been generations earlier a different species, and small changes compiling. Every species on Earth is the result of a common ancestor slowly, gradually changing and adapting to their environment and undergoing random changes that we call mutations. And over time, those changes got significant enough that they were no longer compatible with their relatives who shared that common ancestor, and now they couldn't mate and produce fertile offspring with these other ancestors of their same common relative, but only with ones that had undergone changes similar to them, that had more recent common ancestors, and now we say they're a new species. And that happens again and again and again. And that can only happen given lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of time. Time is the key here, generations. So what does it mean to evolve? We're going to have a whole unit about this, so we're going to make this real quick. But evolving requires changes in the genetic code. And we call these mutations, and they're random. And natural selection. Over time, changes become significant enough that new species form. Okay, so we said that all the changes that actually lead to evolution are random. And again, I don't have time to make a whole lesson on this. We'll do a whole unit on this. But the basic idea is that evolution actually happens just on the basis of random changes to your blueprinting code. Now, you can imagine if you went into a building's blueprints and started randomly changing things, most of the time, what's that going to be? Say there's a new computer chip on the market and you go into the blueprint and you just make a bunch of random changes to the design. 99 times out of 100, maybe 999,000 times out of a million, what's that change going to result in? Probably either nothing or, even worse, something broken, right? But every once in a while, it might just happen to work. Does that make sense? Now, when you do things randomly, it takes a long time. Because again, most changes are either they don't do anything, or even worse, they break something. But every once in a while, you get a new trait. And if you let that happen enough, you get new traits. But then the other thing that has to happen is, we don't have all the species that started out on Earth still today, right? Dinosaurs aren't here. Megalodons aren't here. That beaver that was the size of a black bear isn't here, and I'm pissed about it. But why? That's the natural selection piece. The changes are random. But what changes get passed on aren't random. The changes that break us, if one of your sperm cells has undergone a bunch of mutations and you get married and you procreate, and that sperm happens to be the one that impregnates, that fertilizes the egg, if it's a cataclysmic failure that breaks the species, what happens to that cell? It dies. That's never becomes a baby, that never grows up, never, real young, never get to fall in love, never get to be cool, never have kids, right? Never procreate, which means that traits that give you a disadvantage tend to do what? They tend to die out, because if a trait gives you a disadvantage, then you're less likely to procreate. And if, on the other hand, a trait gives you an advantage, well, then you'll actually be more likely to survive, which means you're more likely to reproduce, which means you're more likely to reproduce than the people over there, which means that gene that had that new trait is actually going to be amplified. It's going to show up more and more because it gives an advantage. Does that make sense? And keep in mind that a trait that's an advantage in one place might be a huge disadvantage somewhere else, right? Some of us have a high body fat composition. Some people have a very low body fat composition. That falls into the entirely normal spectrum of evolutionary biology. But if you live up in the Yukon territories, which of these is evolutionarily advantageous? People with high body fat, right? Because what's that body fat do for you? Keeps you warm, right? And so people whose family lineage comes from northern climates tend to have high body fat percentages because that has been genetically passed along because that was a survival necessity. Whereas people who come from equatorial countries where the sun shines bright all day, now having a higher body fat percentage is a profound disadvantage, right? Because it retains heat, and in a place where the sun is shining down on you all day, you don't want to retain heat. You want to lose heat, right? Does that make sense? So a trait that is advantageous one place is disadvantageous somewhere else. And this is why we get different species in different places. And when you say it out loud, it's really obvious, right? Yeah, obviously, different traits survive well in different places. But you put those two things together, And we say, well, if random changes are happening all the time, and different places on Earth present what we call different selection pressures. They provide different things that are selected for naturally. So if you live in a really hot climate, things that keep you cool are selected for. If you live in a really cold climate, things that keep you warm are selected for. If you live in a climate where there's tons of food, then things that help you compete for food but also run away from the things that are trying to eat you will be advantageous, right? If you live in a desert, things that let you survive a long time between meals are going to be selected for. Does that make sense? Different environments provide different selections. And so when you take the same group of species and spread them out over the world, or even over a small geographic area, random changes start to happen. And those random changes mean that this random change all of a sudden gives me an advantage over everything else living here. That random change is going to help me survive, which means almost certainly that random change that happened to me is going to get passed on. Whereas if that random change had happened somewhere else, it might not get passed on at all. And that's evolution, and it's incredibly complicated, and it's incredibly slow. It only works if you have a really long period of time. And as we discussed the other day, life has been on Earth for a really long period of time. But if you're wondering why, people aren't born the next generation will all of a sudden have tails or wings or something, it's because these things have to happen by random tiny changes in DNA, and you're not one random tiny change in your DNA away, I'm afraid to tell you, from having wings or a tail or breathing fire, other mutant powers that you see in X-Men, right? These changes fully agree. But a shared evolutionary history, the job of taxonomy is to find the shared evolutionary history of living things. We can do this by comparing species that are alive today to those that lived in the past. And we do these comparisons in three broad ways. And if you look, this is exactly what we talked about in the species theory. The first is we can look at anatomy. So shared body plans or shared anatomy tells us that a group of species share a common ancestor in the past. By the way, when we say share an ancestor, who is somebody who doesn't have the same ancestors as you, but shares a lot of them? My sister and I have the exact same set of ancestors, right? We have the same mom, same dad. So in our case, we have the exact same set of ancestors.
Unless one of you's adopted.
Well, my sister keeps saying I'm adopted, but I don't believe it. I haven't got the testing done. She says I'm the weirdo of the family. Me? Weird? Can you imagine? Anyway, but who in my family shares common ancestors with me, even though we don't have the exact same? Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's true for sure, right? Because they share my ancestors, and yet they immediately double up on the equation, right? They have all my ancestors, and they also have all of my wife's ancestors, right? Interesting. Which is a weird thing to think. You have twice as many ancestors as your parents do. And probably not quite twice as many, because somewhere you go back far enough, I hate to tell you this, at some level your parents are cousins. It's up to you how distant that may be, Hopefully we're a few digits deep, right? But got news for you. Everyone's your cousin. You go back far enough. So your parents are some kind of cousins. But yeah.
Are we still answering the question?
Sure, yeah.
Your cousin?
Yeah. Cousins don't share that immediate ancestor, right? They have different parents than you. But depending on how cousin-y they are, they might share your grandparents, or they might share your great-grandparents, right? Depending on whether they're first or second cousins. The first, the second, the third of it tells you how far back, like how many generations back you go. And then the removed bit is if you're on different generations. So if you have like a first cousin, you share grandparents. And if your first cousin once removed, it means you still share those same people, but for the older one, they're the grandparents. But then for the second ones, it's once removed. So for the second ones, it's the great-grandparents. Does that make sense? Okay. It's the same people. And they always base the first or the second or the third cousin bit on like the older cousin, like the higher up generation. Yeah.
What do you mean by once removed?
So like, here we go. Ready? Grandma and grandpa, right? All right. Grandma, grandpa, they have your mom and dad, and then they have your aunt and your uncle, right? And then here's you, all right? And here is your first cousin. Does that make sense? And the reason you're first cousins is because you share grandparents. The definition of first cousins is you share grandparents. So now what if your first cousin has kids?
Those are your removed kids.
Well, this, you share the same ancestor. Does that make sense? So they're still your first cousins. But you have to account for the fact that you share grandparents with them, but they aren't this person's grandparents, they're this person's great-grandparents. So the once removed tells you that they are a generation younger. You share the same people, but they're a generation younger.
I have a bunch of second cousins.
And then, like, if they had a kid, right? Now your grandparent is their great-great-grandparent. That's your first cousin twice removed.
Okay.
And then if they have a kid, you'll probably be long dead. So it's not something you'll need to like talk about. Sorry, it's dark, but it's truth.
You never know.
We're all going to die one day.
No.
No, except me. Because as you know, my plan is to have a student of mine become a brilliant scientist and then put my brain in a jar and give me robot spider legs. I just like want to run
that
around.
From Megamind?
Sure. I've never seen that, but like,
Spider guy. Not spider, the fish guy.
okay, well, I mean, it sounds like you're changing things on me, but we'll run with it. Yes.
I was gonna ask. I'm always confused with if, like, me and somebody else, our parents are cousins.
Yeah. Okay, good, perfect. So now you're second cousins.
Yes.
Because if your parents are cousins, then they share a grandparent, right?
Yeah.
Which means for both of you, that person they share isn't your grandparent. For both of you, it's your great-grandparent, which means that's second cousins. If you share a grandparent, first cousins. If you share a great-grandparent, second cousins. And there'd be no removal there if it's like the same generation. In other words, if your great-grandma is their great-grandma, then you're second cousins.
My second cousin is my mom's first cousin.
I stole a calculator for like 3
Oh, interesting. Yes, that's right. I'd never thought of it that way, but yes, that's exactly right. Oh, good connection. I love this example. Do you know what we're looking at here? We're looking at different species, and we're looking at what? Their arms. Okay, what is this? Whose arm is this? Yeah, this is a primate. We're going to assume it's a human, right? And, of course, you know the anatomy of your arm. You've got the big long bone here. What's it called?
Oh my god, I literally just...
It's not called oh my god.
No, I'm trying to think.
It's also not called I'm trying to think. Just wait till you have the answer, then speak.
Sorry.
H word? The humerus. The humerus, all right? So you've got the humerus here, and then you actually don't have one bone here, you have two. Radius and ulna. Radius and ulna. They're cool because if your hand is in the, let me get this right. Yeah, if your hand is in the pronated position, so everyone put your hand like this, and like this. So palm down, we call that the pronated position. And put your hand here and you can feel radius and ulna, and they go straight along. And now, supinate your hand, and what you'll feel is that they cross. They make an X, right? Yeah, those two bones have to crisscross each other when you supinate your hand. Because one of them basically stays, this bone here stays straightly connected from wrist to elbow, and this one actually pushes the arm over, and to do that, it has to cross. Yeah, so radius and ulna. And then you have here, what do you call these burns? Burns. What do we call these burns? They're the carpals. Do you know them? Can we go? Hamate?
No.
Scaphoid? Pisiform? Lunate?
Yeah.
Something lunate? I can't remember them all. Anyway, I should know them all. I studied this. It's been a long... Yeah, okay, you studied them like 3 weeks ago. I studied them like... You weren't alive when I was studying this. Your parents were probably like young when you're... Your parents were like in high school when I was studying this because I'm old, Kaylin Clark. How old are your parents?
44 and 57.
Okay, so yeah, okay. Well, one of you...
45.
Okay, there we go. Oh, that's making me feel youthful. That's better. I'm feeling good right now.
My dad does have a 35-year-old daughter.
I'll tell you, I had never... It was about 6 years ago I did my first parent-teacher interview at school here when like one of the parents was visibly much younger than I was, and I was just like, oh, he's so old. He's just so old. And then a few years ago, had a student come in and say like, hey, Orlando, you taught my mom. And I was like, no, I didn't. And it turned out I had. It was awful. It was really awful. Anyway, so we have humerus, we have radius, we have ulna, and then we have all these carpals. And these bones are all designed so that your wrist can move in all these really sophisticated ways. It lets things slide against. Then we have these bones here. These are not your fingers. They may look like it, but these are called the metacarpals. They live inside your hand here, and they just run the tendons along that actually do control your fingers. And then these are... the distal phalange, well, the proximal, the middle, and the distal phalanges, right? Including my favorite, digitus minimus. It's the little digit. But anyway, that's our body plan. And it makes perfect sense for how our hand works, right? Like if you look at what all this has to do, we have to be able to go like this, and we have to be able to go like that. We have to be able to move things up and down. We have to be able to flex. Now, what animal is this?
A dog, maybe?
Good guess. Very good guess. It's actually not. These might help you. Just the two of them. It's cat. That's right. This is feline domesticus. Now, interestingly, it has this same setup here. Now, have you ever seen your cat go like this? No. And you never will. They don't do that. It's not a motion they do. And yet, they have the bone structure to do that. There's no reason to have that second bone except what it does in our arm. The reason for that second bone, like I said, is that this bone here stays straight. This one can push this way, and by forming an X over it, it can supinate the hand. It can roll it over so it's up, palm up like this. A cat has that exact same bone. It actually has the muscles too, though they're very undeveloped. Why?
Because they don't need to walk like that. They have no purpose to do that.
And the answer is, there's no why. They don't use it. It's not there for any reason. And if you were designing a cat from the ground up, you wouldn't include this bone and you wouldn't include those muscles. They're wasted. Does that make sense? They're not used. But the cat wasn't designed from the ground up. The cat evolved from something that had the ability to pronate and supinate its hand, and then it evolved to not use that ability in its forelimbs. But it has the bone structure to do it because ancestrally, before cats evolved to lose that ability, a previous mammal had evolved to gain that ability. Now, with a cat, we say like, okay, but a cat leg and a foreleg and a human hand, they're pretty similar. They're doing similar jobs at least, right? They, of course, have evolved some things we don't have. Little claws, this little guy here, but very similar. What is this? Oh, it's...
Nothing.
Yeah, wow. It's a whale. Okay, now here's where things get really crazy. A whale has all these same bones. Now, you ever seen a whale play the violin?
Yeah.
Because it's got fingers. And a whale has fingers. Inside of its flippers, it's got this bone structure of like phalanges. It's got fingers running down there. And it's got a wrist. And by the way, it does no articulation at this level. This thing a whale's flippers really only articulate at key points, and it's not, playing the guitar. But it has all the pieces. Why does it have all the pieces?
Because it evolved from something.
Because it evolved from something that had it. Whales are really interesting. Whales evolved from animals that evolved from the sea, moved to land, developed a bunch of characteristics on land, and then a whale is an example of species that started evolving, moving back into the sea. And so they carry with them the vestiges of this landlocked life where having fingers and having wrists and things like that was useful, and they have evolved not to use those, but they still have the bones. And again, if you were designing a whale from scratch, you wouldn't give it a radius and an ulna. It's not supinating and pronating, it's flipper. And you wouldn't give it fingers, it doesn't need them. But it has them because that's how it evolved. It shares an evolutionary history with us. And the fact that it has these bones, fish don't have these bones, they didn't evolve from us, right? They evolved much further back, our common ancestor with them. And what is this? Of a?
Bird.
No, a bat. A bird wing doesn't have this. A bird wing runs out like this, but a bat's wing literally has fingers. Again, these are the metacarpals, and then the proximal, the middle, and the distal phalanges, just like on your fingers, running through its wing. And again, why does it have those? If you were designing a bat wing from scratch, you wouldn't design it this way. But it evolved from animals that didn't fly. It evolved from mammals, right? So the shared anatomy tells us that a group of species share a common ancestor in the past. Often, traits or features of a species no longer serve a purpose. But are present because of evolutionary history. Does anyone know what we call features that are not purposeful but present? Well, if we're being rude, we call these vestigial traits. Vestigial traits.
Isn't there like a ligament?
Vestiges.
There's like a ligament.
Yeah.
That's like that humans don't use anymore.
Yeah, and I will say, I think there are very few things that are purely vestigial. But like, for example, you have a tailbone. You have a spot on your on the back of your skeleton where there's a little nub for the rest of your tail to grow from. It doesn't serve a purpose for you, but it's there because we evolved from species that had tails. And then as our ancestors go, some of them maintained tails, lots of them didn't. But there's a lot of animals that have a tailbone but no tail. And there's lots of animals that have a tailbone and a tail. And then there's some animals that have no tailbone and no tail. But we're actually more closely related to the animals that have tails and a tailbone than the ones that don't. Because even though we don't have a tailbone, yeah. Yes?
You said earlier that we're really far away from growing a tail, but if we have the bones to create a tail, are we really that far away?
Okay, that's a little bit more beyond my, I don't know. I think we're 12 generations from having a tail. I don't know. I'm not trying to be rude. I don't know the answer to that. But the point is, we don't have tails. But we have evidence that, like, our ancestors did have tails. All right, now, keep in mind, just like we said, we can look beyond anatomy. When we look at physiology, looking at how cells function, enzymes, organ structure, I'm going to say organ function, and such things, is also used to determine relatedness. Yeah, sorry, this is really messy. I'm worried I'm taking too long. And a classic example is the horseshoe crab, which is more closely related to a spider than it is to the Dungeness crab. These happen to be cases where we call them both crabs because historically we thought, oh yeah, these things look pretty similar. They behave pretty similarly in the water. We think they must be very closely evolutionarily related. And what we found is that some crabs are kind of along this family tree. Some crabs are along this family tree, and they're not actually very closely related to one another. And you wouldn't know that to look at them. The big thing being they live at the bottom of the ocean. They eat mollusks and things like that. But the way we know that is by looking at, we discovered this looking at their enzymatic function. How do their enzymes work? How do their cells work? What kind of chemicals do they produce in their gut? Things like that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then what's the gold standard? What's the best way to compare how related things are? And now it's so easy to do and so cheap. But 20 years ago, it was incredibly expensive, and 30 years ago, we couldn't do it. Well, now 40 years ago, we couldn't do it at all. DNA testing. All right. The gold standard for comparing how related things are is by looking at their genetics, looking at their DNA. Where in the cell do we find genetics? Where do we find the DNA? That's right, in the chromosomes, which is found in the nucleus, assuming it's a eukaryote and has a nucleus. If it's a prokaryote, its DNA just sits out in the middle of the cell. But the DNA, we're going to do a whole unit on this, so don't get too into it. Don't get too stressed about it, but it's a big chain. It's a chain of molecules that can be read like a code. And it's the blueprint for that species. And we should really say that individual, because you and I have overwhelmingly similar DNA, but we have some differences, which is why we have different traits. But we'll keep it simple here. DNA evidence is the most modern and precise way to say how related two species are. And as a general rule, the more similar the DNA, the more recently they have a common ancestor. So our closest relative on Earth is the chimpanzee by this metric. If we take the metric of comparing our DNA to the DNA of other living things, then you run our DNA and literally look at the code. And again, we'll get into a whole unit on this. But the DNA code is actually, literally, it's words written that in an alphabet that spells out how to make your thing. And it's not a big alphabet. How many letters in our alphabet? Yeah. There's only 4 in the DNA alphabet. And it only takes 4 letters to code to make you, which may sound unsophisticated, but you think like your phone and your computers and all these things, they actually only have an alphabet of 2, 0 and 1, and they can do all kinds of complicated things, right? Like your computer can, when information is stored, when you actually look at how it's stored on the computer, it's just a big chain of zeros and ones, and the computer knows how to interpret that as information. Your DNA is just a big chain of 4 letters, and your cells know how to interpret that and build things. Those letters form words called codons, and if there's 4 letters and you group them by 3, how many possible codons are there? How many combinations? Oh. Well, the first one, you'd have how many options? 4 options, 4 letters, right? And then the second one, you'd have how many options? No, 4 again. And then the third one, you'd have how many options? 4 again. So it's just 4 times 4 times 4. 4 times 4 is? 16. Times 4 again is? Nope, double it. 64, good. So there's 64 possible kind of letters like this that you'll see, and those represent, as it turns out, the amino acids that can be used to make your proteins. And don't worry about that now. I'll do a whole unit on it. But if you're wondering what DNA codes for, DNA is literally a blueprint how to build proteins, and those are the parts of the cell that do stuff, the little machines of the cell. Hopefully you talked about that a little bit in grade 10 science. If not, don't worry about it. And so if you look here, this would be an example of looking at one small section of a gene. In other words, of your DNA. And what we can find, in this case, this is a gene that codes for something. And I'm trying to remember which one I grabbed here. I think this is specifically hemoglobin. Does anyone know what hemoglobin is, what it does? You should learn this in grade 10, yeah? It's in the blood, yeah? What's it do in the blood? Nope. Those are platelets, but good thinking. Carries oxygen. Good, very good. You guys are great. Don't worry if you didn't know that, because that's fine. We're going to learn that this year. But if you look here, the molecule is pretty similar through all these different animals, right? But you can see it's not identical, because they've mutated, right? So these are slightly different due to mutations. And what we do is we say the consensus, we take the version of this gene and say, well, what's the most common version of each letter here? And then we see for each of these how close to the common version they are. So if you look here, humans and pigs, for this little section of DNA, our DNA is exactly the same. Humans and dogs, our version is exactly the same. But mice and rats, very similar to ours, but a little different, just at the end. Does that make sense? And then chickens, a little bit more different from ours. There's a few more changes. Frogs, a little bit more different than ours, a few changes. And so it stands to reason, now, you can't do it just looking at one small section of the DNA. You have to do it for the whole thing, which is enormous. But if you look here, this would suggest that we are more closely related to pigs than we are to rats. Well, okay, I can believe that. And it would also suggest that we're more closely related to all of these things than we are to frogs. Well, does that make sense based on the simpler models? Yeah, I think so. So that's how we'd observe this. Now, what do we do with this? Well, from that we can start to build this idea of a family tree, or what we call a phylogenetic tree. And in a phylogenetic tree, each branching location represents a common ancestor. And we usually look at traits to try to figure out what this might look like. And of course, if you look at all our traits, this can get very confusing. But we try to make sort of a basic approach to it. So what can we learn from this? Well, from this, what could we learn? Well, we could learn, for example, that what might have evolved here, where one path leads us to mammals and another path leads us to turtles, snakes and lizards, crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds. What trait could have been at sea? So what evolves at sea where we have it in common with all of these guys, but not amphibians and not ray-finned fish? Because again, we have it in common with these guys. So you wouldn't say, for example, fur here, right? Because this is a common ancestor, which means the turtles, the snakes, and the lizards would share that with us. But maybe all of these tend to breathe solely above water, right? So we know about this ancestor that it would breathe air, that it would live above water. Do you know what I mean? And we can start to describe, would it have had, looking at all these, would it have had a spinal cord? Yeah. Now, interestingly, amphibians also. So here, this common ancestor probably also had a spinal cord. In fact, this could be where the spinal cord evolved. Does that make sense? Ray-finned fish, I don't think, have spinal cords. I might be wrong about that. And if I am, then that couldn't be where the spinal cord evolved. But does that make sense? At each branching point, we can say that after that, and then somewhere along here is where we would have evolved hair, is where we would have evolved mammary glands, right? Is where we would have evolved live birth, right? All of that evolved after our most recent common ancestor with all these. Does that kind of make sense? I know we only have 5 minutes left, but that's okay. We're going to draw one of these just to send you on your way. So I want you to take a look at this, and I'll show you how we usually draw this, which is to make life easy. What I usually do is just draw a kind of timeline like this. And I say, okay, between our oldest common ancestor and then let's talk about humans. We'll make this kind of about humans. Where did branching off happen? Well, if you look here at just the species we're looking at here, humans have vertebrae, so do kangaroos, so do bullfrogs, and so do sharks, right? But what doesn't? A bacterium. So what we would say is we could go here and say, well, the bacteria must have branched off before we get vertebrae. Does that make sense? And vertebrae must evolve in the middle here. Does that make sense? And then, this one's pretty simple. What trait evolved next? 2 pairs of limbs. But before that, what evolutionary line branches off? The sharks, right? Because sharks don't have that trait. So somewhere between here and there, we get the branching off of sharks, right? And then what trait evolved next? Mammary glands. But who didn't get mammary glands? Yeah, frogs. Frogs don't have mammary glands. And of course, nor did sharks or bacteria, but we know that because they've already branched off, right? So this would branch off, and somewhere after that branching, we must get all the things that make a frog, right? And then, what branched off next? Kangaroos. And only after kangaroos do we evolve what? Placentas. Good. What's a placenta? Not in, but it is the organ of the baby, actually, that grows up against the endometrial lining of a woman's womb, where nutrient exchange happens, right? So it's how... Yeah, it's a thing. I don't really get it, but who am I to judge? The answer is I'm nobody to judge, but not my thing. Sure, but you know what else does? I don't know, like craft dinner. But again, people should do what they want to do. And if somebody wants to eat their placenta, listen, you push an 8-pound object out of your genitalia, you can do whatever you want the next day. That's entirely your business. Like, it has nothing to do with me. Okay, so that example there where we drew the cladogram, that was a fairly easy one, right? Simple traits to work with. I've got some homework here for you. I want you to do some practice. So go through and do these questions. And at the end of it, it's going to have you draw a cladogram from a slightly more complicated one. Do your best with it, all right? I want to move through this stuff fairly quickly because we're going to move into more interesting stuff. And the sooner we get to the more interesting stuff, the happier I am. If you don't yet have your safety stuff done, A, you're dead to me. B, get it done. But refer back to A. What are you?
Dead.
Dead to me. Yes. No, I stand by it.